Hi, how are you? Welcome on into another podcast by George. And I saw that promo there. I'm wearing the same shirt, the red shirt that I had on then. I've changed a little bit, folks. That shirt, that photo was a few years ago. I'm coming up on a 5-year anniversary for the show, and I've gotten older and a little bit heavier. I think my teammates in hockey could tell you that for sure. But after 5 years of doing this, I've got some great shows coming up. Today is one, the great Bill Astore from Bracing Views on Substack is going to come on the show from the Eisenhower Media Network. But Monday now, if it holds together, and after seeing kind of an unseemly version of the Jimmy Dore show this past couple of days, I don't know if it will, but the great Dr. Cornel West is scheduled to come on my show live. Now, I'm hoping that happens. It's on 9/11. And I asked him about that, and they said, no, he'll come on. Now, I haven't heard from him in a couple of days, but I'm holding my breath. I've got my fingers and toes crossed, hoping that that's going to happen. And then later this month, maybe a kind of a semi-official celebration of the 5-year anniversary of Podcast by George. I'm going to have Lee Camp on, because I reference him all the time. He does great work. I greatly admire this guy. He's come on my show in the past when I've asked him. So Lee is scheduled to come on September 20th. And of course, we'll have a lot of great shows in between, including today's. And I hope you saw the promotion for this on YouTube. It has to do about words about war, YouTube and Facebook, I should say. Also, people that watch my show know that I talk about that all the time. The words that are chosen, that are selected, that are put down on paper, that are broadcast, that are said. Why do they choose the words that they choose? Why do they choose the images that they choose? The video. Well, is it too dumb, or are they in on it? I think they might be in on it, folks. I think they're trying to engender a response from you all, and that's what we're going to be talking about today with Bill Astore. Lieutenant Colonel retired William J. Astore is with the Eisenhower Media Network, and he served in the U.S. Air Force for 20 years. He was a professor of history and has written extensively for TomDispatch.com, Truth Out, History News Network, Alternate, Salon, Antiwar.com, and Huffington Post, among other sites. He is the author or co-author of 3 books. Now, most recently, Soldiers' Lives Through History, The Early Modern World, and that was co-written with Dennis E. Showalter. Get this, you talk about bona fides, and I underline or emphasize this all the time, folks. Go with people that have been correct in the past, and he has. Go with people that have the background and the experience, which he has. Don't go with some talking head, maybe myself included, that's never been there, that's never done that. Go with people like this. He earned a BS with distinction in mechanical engineering from Worcester Polytechnic Institute, an MA from the Johns Hopkins University, History of Science and Technology, and a DPhil, a Doctor of Philosophy, from the University of Oxford, Modern History. He's taught at the Air Force Academy, the Naval Postgraduate School, and the Pennsylvania College of Technology. And I'm just delighted to have him on our show. Let's click a couple of buttons here and see if we can get the technology to work and bring him on in here and say good morning to our good buddy Bill Astore. Hi, Bill.
Thanks, George. We definitely need to shorten that intro.
Yeah, but I tell people that when it's all said and done, this is who we are. This is what we are, and it goes from being read on Podcast by George, my little bio included, to the tombstone. So
right.
You get it out there while we can. Hey, I wanted to show you this because I had this in queue. And this is why I do the show. I was talking about this 5-year anniversary. And we're going to go, this is mainstream media, folks. This is the front page of the USA Today, a day or two ago. And this is what's going on. This is why the left wing needs to be heard and seen on shows like mine, because this just goes by and we're kind of conditioned to expect this to be normal. And that's kind of what we're talking about today. Look at these headlines that I've circled. Blinken announces a $1 billion in aid during a visit. Yeah, I don't know if you follow the news or not, folks, but Anthony Blinken is running around the country, everywhere from Australia to Iraq, selling weapons. This guy's the State Department head. He's supposed to be our chief diplomat. He hasn't done any diplomacy since his ass hit the seat in the State Department. He's a weapons salesman. He's providing military aid. That's what he does. There's one at the bottom. More state lawmakers are fighting to protect Confederate statues. My God, really? And then this one in the middle is so small, I don't know that I can even read it. But it has to do with the fact that, a huge percentage, 70, 80% of Americans believe nothing's going to get done about climate. Of course, that's a big thing on my show because they don't think we can suck it up, that anybody's willing to do anything about it. And of course, everybody's looking at the guy next door. Nobody's looking at themselves. Nobody's looking in the mirror. But that's just the front page of the USA Today, which is not wildly left. I mean, they're center to center right, probably. But I don't know. Does that ever strike you, Bill, when you look at the headlines?
Well, it's funny. I wrote an article probably about a dozen years ago now where I said that the State Department was a tiny branch of the Pentagon.
Yes.
Because back then, even under Hillary Clinton, it seemed like the main mission was going around the world and selling American weapons to various countries. I think the budget of the State Department is roughly, I think it's less than 10% of the Pentagon budget. So essentially, the State Department is really the poor relation to
Yes.
the military-industrial complex. And then, you mentioned global warming, of course, and the Pentagon burns so much fossil fuels that if the Pentagon was a country, I think the Pentagon burns as much as the country of Sweden. So if we want to somehow limit global warming, one of the big ways of doing that is just downsizing the military footprint or our imperialism around the world.
Yeah, I had someone on my show recently, and people that watched it saw my jaw about hit the floor. I think they were kind of speaking in support of Biden, but they were saying, for the first time in a long time, we're not at war. We're at war in at least a half a dozen countries right now. I mean, I can run through the list.
Right.
And we have what they're, and this again, this is a great segue into the show we're talking about today. The United States admits being involved in counterterrorism activities in 85 countries, 85 countries. And of course, we have 800 military bases encircling the globe, for God's sake, including all of these countries that are threatening us, supposedly. We've got them surrounded, and a $1 trillion annually renewable military budget, Bill.
Right. Well, yeah, we don't use that word war anymore, as
Yes.
you know. We sort of banished that. Back in the old days, we had a Department of War, and then after World War II, we decided to cloak the language, and so we came up with the Department of Defense. And we don't even declare war anymore. The last time we declared war was after Pearl Harbor in 1941. Now we talk about overseas contingency operations. We make fun of Putin and Russia. Russia.
Yes.
Putin came up with the special military operation. It's like, look at him, using Orwellian language. It's like, well, guess what? He learned it from us.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking about Orwell a little bit. I'm a huge fan of 1984, Animal Farm, just Orwell in general. I was in the 1984 play, as a matter of fact. My God, no truer words were ever spoken. Okay, let's get into it because that's really what we're talking about here. We're talking about Bracing Views and Bill's Substack, and it's entitled "Talking and Writing Honestly About War." Bill says, as a retired Air Force officer and military historian, I'm familiar with all kinds of euphemisms about killing, precision bombing, and collateral damage. Just as it's easier to kill at a distance, it's easier to kill when we use words that provide distance from the act, words that facilitate detachment, words that befuddle and confuse our minds. And we have been doing it for decades now, folks. It's got to be working. Evidence is all around us. Bill says, when writing honestly about war, it's best to use bullet hits the bone words: atrocity, murder, war crime, slaughter, rape, pillage, burn. They're all old words associated with war, and these words often most fittingly describe war and its likely effects and outcomes. Powerful, blunt, and accurate words should remind us that war is inherently horrible and also profoundly anti-democratic. War is consistent with authoritarianism and lack of freedom, yet Americans nowadays seem to think war and words about war are conducive to democracy and freedom, e.g., Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Ukraine. And we used to know better. And you can talk about this, Bill. You know, the grunts, the people, the cannon fodder, the guys that are at risk of having to go stand in front of mortar shells and machine guns. They don't necessarily use this terminology.
No, you don't get BS at the front line. You
Yeah.
talk to privates and sergeants and Marines, and you'll get very blunt talk, probably mixed in with a few expletives. I remember attending as a dean of students at the Defense Language Institute, Presidio of Monterey. We would have troops from all the 4 services there graduating. And every now and then, when a Marine crossed the stage, someone would shout, "Kill!" And it was like, ooh, that's a little impolite. But isn't that what military service is about? I mean, to a certain extent, we train young troops to be able to kill. That is what militaries do. But we often, we suppress that. We don't think about it. We prefer not to think about it.
Well, yeah, and that kill thing in the Marines in particular. Now, you're much more familiar with the branches of the military than I am, but from what I understand, the Marines are basically the most brainwashed of all of the branches. I mean, because of their training and what they're the point of the spear. I mean,
hey, that's not brainwashing.
Yeah.
That's esprit de corps.
Yeah. Well, they're taught that you're here to die and you're here to kill. I mean, that's what you do. That's who you are. And
Right.
it's effective. It works. Yeah. And speaking of how we are propagandized, but what we're told and what we're shown, here's something from Bill's Substack. Now, if you have a weak stomach, folks, you might want to look away from this. But this is what we're talking about. This is an image here that was seen around the world in a lot of places, really, Al Jazeera and other places, but it was not seen or shown in the United States. This is the Iraq War. And my point of view, and, I'll hold up this book here so that people can see it. Chris Hedges, this entire book really is devoted to trying to get people to understand the horrible nature of war, which we're not seeing. I mean, this is just one little glimpse of it here. And I like to reference this all the time. This was highly effective. This is one of the most effective wire photos, or one of the most famous ever taken. This is in the Vietnam War. This is the burning girl running from that village after a napalm attack. Right. We were shown that. We saw that. If we're exposed to war, people will naturally they'll repulse from it, Bill.
Right. No, absolutely. Yeah, that image from Vietnam of the napalm strike. I mean, it gives a lie to the idea of precision bombing, right?
Yes.
Because we have this notion that when the Air Force or Navy or whatever, when they drop bombs, it's against the enemy. But oftentimes it's not the enemy. It's civilians. Sometimes it's children. It's innocents who end up getting bombed and napalmed and strafed and torn apart by our weaponry.
Yeah, and the other thing that I tell people, and I don't want to. Vietnam is really significant, and Bill's a military historian, and he can segue and dovetail these things to Vietnam. I can do it from my own experience, but My Lai, not to be overlooked. Everybody just seems to have forgotten about that. I mean, CBS News had the guy with the cigarette lighter setting the hooch on fire over there, and people went, "My God, they're burning up these people's grass roofs, huts. I mean, that's what we're doing over there." Well, yeah. Then My Lai came out, that great reporting from Seymour Hersh, and people still aren't believing Seymour. But my God, what a war crime that was. And people went, "But that's what this is? That's what we're doing?" And Bill's with the Eisenhower Media Network. Matt Ho, when he was on national television, they talked to him about that collateral murder video that Assange released. And he looked befuddled and said, well, what do you think we were doing over there? What do you think war is? It ain't a high school football game, folks. It is, by its very nature, you could use the second word with war. It's a war crime.
Right. No, I mean, My Lai was a horrible thing. But of course, as the book from Nick Turse, where he talks about Vietnam and the kill everything that moves. Unfortunately, My Lai was not the exception. It's exceptional in the sense that we found out about it, and it's well documented. But even that was almost an accident. It required it required a couple of whistleblowers to come forward, and it also required, as you said, Cy Hirsch's reporting, because of course the Army tried to cover it up, and so too did the Nixon administration. When they first found out about My Lai, it obviously their first impulse, unfortunately, is how do we suppress this? How do we cover it up? Instead of saying, okay, this is a very bad thing that happened. We need to bring the people responsible to account. Instead, the opposite takes place. It's like, how do we cover up? How do we make this war crime go away?
Yeah, and like I said, I don't want to spend the entire show looking back at Vietnam, but the Seymour Hersh, the guy, he's on Substack too. Follow this guy. Believe what he's telling you. His reporting, he's a Pulitzer Prize winner. I mean, this guy's to be believed. He's been deplatformed by all of the major media in this country because he's reporting on these war crimes, basically, anti-war stuff that they don't want to see on their pages. They don't want to see on their television screen. And the last thing I'll say about Hersh and My Lai, I was surprised, but you probably already knew this, but Hirsch says he could have reported worse stuff. He was kind of afraid to back then. You got to remember when this was. He didn't know what the reaction would be to it. Maybe he didn't know how it would impact him personally if he reported worse things. But if My Lai, they put women and children in a trench. They bayoneted them. Women were raped. I mean, this was horrific stuff, Bill.
Right. No, absolutely. And so as a result, you can see why there was a cover up. I always remember, I think it's Philip Caputo's book, A Rumor of War, where he was a young lieutenant in Vietnam, and he's talking to a sergeant, and the sergeant basically says to him that, Caputo, Lieutenant Caputo, you're going to discover in the Vietnam War what horrible things American teenagers, 19, 20 years old, do under the stresses of combat. And that's what we saw in My Lai.
Yeah, it reminds me of the movie Fury that I saw with Brad Pitt. Now, I'm not going to recommend that to anybody because, as Chris Hedges will tell you, that's kind of war porn. I mean, it's meant to titillate and make people feel patriotic. I don't know what the hell, but there is one scene in there that's very good when the young recruit shows up at the tank for the first time, and they've just cleaned away the remains of who he's replacing. Right. The one guy looks at him and says, "Where do you see it?" And he said, "See what? See what one man can do to another. See what they. I mean, yeah, that's war." Okay, let me get back into this. I want to read through this a little bit. Okay, so this is really the genesis, the reason that I just wanted to do this show right away today. Bill writes, fortunately, there's a new guide and website available that alerts us to the importance of language and war. The website is wordsaboutwar.org. That's wordsaboutwar.org, from which you can read and download suggestions. We're going to get into some of this on how best to use words to convey the horrors and costs of war to people everywhere, and to bypass, do an end run, go around the blob and its military and the mainstream media handmaidens that are repeating this stuff. And again, they've been doing it for decades. Bill says, I urge you to visit the site and peruse the guide. Full disclosure, Bill says, I was an advisor to this effort, which was ably led by David Vine. And I just started to follow him on Substack as well. So another great author, David Vine, folks, follow him. When you go to this website, this is what you'll be met with: words about war that matter. And here's this. We talked about Orwell. Now I'm going to see if I can read this, but this is great. This was written in 1946, folks. Orwell wrote in Politics and the English Language, defenseless villages are bombarded from the air, the inhabitants driven out into the countryside, the cattle machine gunned, the huts set on fire with incendiary bullets. This is called pacification. Millions of peasants are robbed of their farms and sent trudging along the roads with no more than they can carry. This is called transfer of population or rectification of frontiers. People are imprisoned for years without trial or shot in the back of the neck and sent to die of scurvy in Arctic lumber camps. This is called elimination of unreliable elements. Such phraseology is needed if one wants to name things without calling up mental pictures of them. Okay, that's a little bit dated. It's a little bit extreme. But they write here on the website that from George Orwell's critique of the language of totalitarian regimes to today, discussions of war and foreign policy have been full of dehumanizing euphemisms, bloodless jargon, little-known government acronyms, and troubling metaphors that hide warfare's damage. This guide, now it's words about war, folks. The guide aims to help people write and talk about war and foreign policy more accurately, more honestly, and in ways people outside the elite Washington, D.C. foreign policy blob can understand. All right, so I wanted to go through some of these, Bill, but anything here you want to add before we jump into this?
No, I just I really enjoyed working on the words about war.org effort. And again, you're going to go through some of the suggestions.
Yeah.
But when you stop and think about some of the words that we've been using to, or should I say, the foreign policy types and the think tanks and on television and so on, they really are designed sort of in a almost like a soporific way, to put you to sleep, or to bore you, or to using words in the sense of trying to convey or sort of a patriotic sentiment.
Yeah.
And all of this can be misleading when you're talking about something as brutal and nasty as war.
Yeah, and I guess I would say it dovetails very nicely with what I talk about all the time, which is the promulgation of the status quo. It's to keep things the way that they are. So them that got it gets to keep it, and them that don't ever get a chance to get it. I mean, and what is the status quo in this country? Well, it's pretty much weaponry. It's pretty much war. Oil's in there someplace, but the status quo in this country is war. If you don't think so, pick up a damn history book because that's really who we are. My God, we are drenched in this blood, and it's got to change if we're going to survive. And that's what we're talking about today with the great Bill Astore. Let me bring this up on screen so that I can read through this, because this is kind of small. People might not be able to read it, but here's a terminology that we want to avoid. We hear this all the time, Bill: all volunteer force. A better alternative is all recruited force, paid or post draft military. Now you can see I have a little difficulty reading that, but this all volunteer army. Yeah, they say that all the time, and that's what we're talking about. How this just gets to be believed, but a lot of these people, a lot of these young men in these rural areas and this type of thing, yeah, they're volunteering, but they're volunteering for a future life, for an education, for a retirement. I mean, it's because of these benefits that the military provides.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, some people use the term poverty draft in the sense that a lot of people who not a lot, but quite a few people who join the military, as you say, they're obviously attracted to the pay and benefits. They're attracted to free healthcare, which we should all have, but which we don't. So if you want, government subsidized healthcare, you join the military.
Yeah.
That's one way of getting it. And so, as you know, what we're trying to do with this words about war effort is just try to get people to think more deeply about the words that they use and also the words that they read about war.
Well, take this one then. And I'm sick of hearing this phrase, boots on the ground. Every time I hear that, I yell at the TV, blood and guts on the ground and bodies and corpses. Boots on the ground, Bill.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's again, when you use words like that or images like that, uh, it sort of has it's not conducive, as Orwell said. These phrases are designed so that you
Yes.
don't really think about how horrible war is. And I have to say that as a military member, you talk about specifically who these troops are. If it's Marines, call them Marines. If it's Army, call them soldiers. Don't refer to them generically as like an object, like, oh, they're just a bunch of boots on the ground. In a way, it's not only sort of it's almost in a way, I think it's insulting to the troops that we send all over the world in harm's way.
Yeah, I mean, every one of these, a casualty. Now, this hits me because I hear these, I read these news stories talking about Ukraine in particular. They talk about shit, hundreds of thousands of casualties. And I look at what are they talking about? It everything from a paper cut to a death they're talking about loss of life a lot of times. When you look at these numbers, it's really hard to believe, but it's all cloaked in this word casualty.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, again, when you're actually in the military, we use much more honest terms. We talk
Yeah.
about KIA,
Yes.
WIA, we killed in action, wounded in action, and we also talk about the severity of those wounds. And we need to recognize, a casualty is another one of those words that sort of puts you to sleep and lulls you. These words lull you into a sort of complacency about what the
Yes.
United States is doing overseas. And we need to wake up. We need to get out of this complacency and recognize the violence that is occurring.
Yeah, and here I got some comments here from the great Suzanne Murphy. I want to get up on the screen, but it isn't just it's just not the blob and the war pigs that are doing this. It's the stenographers. It's the media that is repeating this, that have to think about before they put these words down on paper. Why do they do that? And I like to talk all the time, as you know, Bill, about the scene in the movie Casino. And are they too dumb or are they in on it? Here, let's watch a little bit. I don't play this very often, but here's a little bit of the scene to set this up. The slot machines in the casino, 3 jackpots in a row have just been hit, and De Niro is me, and the slot manager, the tall guy that he's talking to here, could be the media. Here it is.
Listen, if you didn't know you're being scammed, you're too fucking dumb to keep this job. If you did know, you were in on it. Either way, you're out. Get out. Go on. Let's go.
Yeah, so where do you come down on that, Bill? I mean, are these just a bunch of kids and old dummies that don't know any better, or are they in on it when they repeat these talking points and these words?
I think they're in on it. To answer the question succinctly, but I also think that over time, when you've been exposed to these words, over and over again, we all tend to repeat things, repeat what's around us. We are immersed in a certain culture, if you will. And if you're a journalist, I think, or a writer, you learn what words are acceptable and what words are not acceptable. One of the things that strikes me about the military today is the use of business speak. So nowadays, I run across a lot of talk about how we're investing in weaponry or investing in nuclear weapons. That I actually hear Pentagon officials talk about leveraging our assets overseas. as if they're a bunch of stockbrokers, right? and I like to joke that maybe they're doing this so that they can, more speedily pass through the revolving door when they retire. And they're going to go work for Lockheed Martin or Boeing or Raytheon anyway. They may as well get used to all the business speak. But that's another way that we use this sort of bloodless language as a sort of substitute for talking honestly about war. I mean, General Sherman had it right. Sherman said war is all hell, and he said war is cruelty, and we cannot refine it. And yet, there's too many people in our country who are trying to refine war and try to anesthetize the rest of us to how horrible it is.
Yeah. So Sherman, he would have been talking about the Civil War.
Yeah.
Yeah, and all of the horror, but I mean, if you were lucky enough to survive a fusillade, they cut it off you. I mean, we were talking about arms and legs, and I mean, they just did
right.
it.
But George, here's the thing. When you think about when Sherman was writing his memoirs and talking about war, that was a time when every American, virtually every American, had lived through the Civil War. Over 600,000 Americans lost their lives in the Civil War. And that was when we only had a population of about 32 million. In the 1860s, 1870s, when Sherman is writing, Americans knew what war was all about. We knew from direct experience. You could see veterans in the village square who were missing limbs. Everyone knew the cost of war. It was obvious because just about everyone had lived through it. Nowadays, Americans, for the most part, unless you're a veteran who served in Iraq or Afghanistan or elsewhere, we Americans are kept isolated from war. And words like the ones we're talking about are part of that effort to keep Americans isolated from war's true horrors and its costs.
Yeah, I wanted to bring this up from Suzanne Murphy. She was just a guest on my show, folks. That was just the show prior. Go back and check that out. It's great. She just sailed with the Golden Rule, the sailboat for peace, and the anti-nuclear woman. And she also is admin of Truth Bomb Activists on Facebook. So check that show out. But she says, is there information on how we use language, dehumanizing citizens of nations we target for our agendas? Thereby allowing us to justify our aggressions morally. Well, that's kind of what we're talking about with this website that you contributed to, Bill. But how would you respond to that?
Oh, yes. Well, if you go to wordsaboutwar.org and you look at the dictionary there, we do get into how we do warn against the use of language to dehumanize other groups of people, but we don't get in specifically into how that's been done in the past. Obviously, there are a lot of books on this. We all know, at least, we recall the ethnic slurs used against the Vietnamese. If you read history, you read a book like John Dower's A War Without Mercy, which covers the American war against Japan in World War II. Basically, what we've done historically is to dehumanize the enemy. And the way that we do that, I mean, all militaries do this to a certain extent. And what happens is, whether you're fighting against Native Americans, you're fighting against Germans during World War I, the Japanese in World War II, and the Germans as well, or there's always that tendency to see the enemy as something less than human.
We're talking about gooks, slopes. Haji, what was the term?
I mean, there are much worse terms than Haji from the Iraq War that I won't repeat here. So yeah, exactly. I didn't know if you wanted to get into those terms, but
that's what we're talking about. Yeah,
exactly.
And it's to keep you from thinking about the humanity, and that's also this terminology, which is a form of propaganda going back to Orwell that they're also wanting us to get to. Well, let me bring this up on screen here. I wanted a couple of these things. Collateral damage, that one's kind of obvious. Civilian killing, deaths, and murders. Defense budget spending, contractor contracts, industry analyst, expert strategy. Again, everything but the word war. The Defense Department, Department of Defense. A lot of people say that it ought to be called the Department of War. But the ultimate irony of that, you mentioned Putin and our own military excursions. These aren't officially declared wars, Bill.
That's yeah, that's true. And that's basically because they're wars of choice, in my opinion. These are not wars of necessity. If we had a war of necessity where America was, directly attacked, I think Congress would issue a formal declaration of war, as it did after Pearl Harbor, and which is what our Constitution requires, by the way. If the United States as a country goes to war, we are only supposed to do that when there is a constitutional declaration. Unfortunately, as we all know, that America nowadays sends troops everywhere and has an imperial foreign policy without any declaration of war whatsoever. We hide behind this generic term of defense, and that's because it's a term that most people, it resonates with people. Oh, Americans are just defending themselves. That's okay. But when you look at what we're doing, it's much more offensive in nature than it is defensive in nature, and it's resource driven. It's whether we want oil or lithium or strategic minerals or control over sea lanes or what have you. We're not doing this for defensive purposes. We're often driven by the pursuit of money and power and dominance, just as empires in the past were driven by those same goals.
Yeah, think about the words, folks, and you'll realize they're pissing down your back and telling you that it's raining. I mean, and they've been doing it for days. Think about that bug-eyed Gomer out there in California, Adam Schiff, telling us that we've got to fight the Russians over there in Ukraine, or they're coming over here. Hell, they're not coming over here, and it's just not somebody like him. Tulsi Gabbard, who I used to like, and has completely gone off the rails, it looks like to me. I'm trying to get her to come on my show and explain herself a little bit, but she just went on an op. She's still in the military to some place in the deepest, darkest part of Central Africa. They couldn't even be revealed, I think, and she came back and said that she was doing that to keep us safe. I'm like, how in the hell does that keep us safe? I don't know where you were at over there, but I don't think it's a threat to me or to this country. The Russians, as an example, they ain't coming. They've been talking about it since the Bolshevik Revolution. Bill knows more about this than I do. Since World War I, for God's sake. And the only Russian I've ever met plays hockey with me, and he's got a 17-year-old cat, Bill.
Yeah. Well, people forget that actually the United States briefly went to war against Russia during the Russian Civil War right after World War One. Now, this is going back over 100 years, but I can tell you the Russians haven't forgotten that. We were trying to, we got involved in that to try to defeat the Bolsheviks. Obviously, that didn't work. The Bolsheviks won. And then, of course, during World War II, we were allies with Stalin and the Soviet Union because it was convenient for us to be allies. And the Soviet Union, more than any other country, was responsible for defeating Nazi Germany and suffered the most. The Soviet Union suffered the most during World War II from having to bear the lion's share of the burden in defeating the Wehrmacht.
Okay, we're probably not going to get through this whole thing because every one of these is just, here's a Defense Secretary of Defense. We talked about the revolving door. Lloyd Austin, former CEO of Raytheon. He went from the military to that. When Biden's term is over with, or what, he'll probably go back to that. He's nothing but a war pig, weapons salesperson. That's our Secretary of Defense. Enemy non-combatants, they're civilians. Okay, on my show, I hardly ever say the word civilian, particularly when I'm talking about Iraq and that, 500,000 to 1 million dead civilians over there killed for a misbegotten misadventure, known lie by the United States. I refer to it as men, women, children, and little bitty babies. That's who civilians are, Bill.
Yeah, that's right. And whenever you bring up Iraq and you talk about the Iraqis who died, I always think of the infamous quote of Madeleine Albright, on 60
Yes.
Minutes, where they were talking about the sanctions. I mean, sanctions are a form of war as well.
Yes, they are.
We could mention that the idea that somehow economic sanctions are, oh, it's just sanctions are just ways that we can sort of coerce these countries, but it really doesn't hurt anyone. They're just sanctions. But as we know, I mean, they asked Madeleine Albright about this, that the sanctions were causing the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi people. And basically, Madeleine Albright infamously said, we think that the United States, think that price is worth it.
Nah. And it just goes on. And we're in the D's here looking at this Secretary of Defense thing. I wanted to get to one here that I wanted to have on screen in particular. Let me see if I can get this up large again. Hawks and doves says don't use. Why not, Bill?
I'm sorry?
Why not say hawks and doves? Everybody does it.
Yeah, hawks and doves. I like birds. I mean, I don't. The idea that the hawk is a noble bird. I really like birds of prey. In fact, supposedly my last name Astore is a type of hunting hawk in Italian.
Wow.
And we sort of bestow a certain amount of nobility on these, like Donald Rumsfeld or Dick Cheney. If we call them hawks, it's almost like we're calling them a positive thing. Like, look at that noble bird of prey. I actually think that we commit a crime against the animal kingdom by comparing humans, especially someone like Cheney or Rumsfeld, to a bird as noble as the hawk.
Yeah, good point. We don't call them snakes and spiders. I mean, that
would be a little better.
Yeah, I mean, some
although
people,
it mimight be an insult to snakes.
Yeah, yeah, because some people like snakes, and so there isn't anybody that likes war. Anybody that's been exposed to it, in a firsthand fashion, unless they're a complete psychopath. I mean, unless they're Jeffrey Dahmer or something like that, there isn't anybody that likes this. Military exercises, military footprint. We hear about that all the time. Military sites, locations, and facilities. Let's see here. National interest, national security threats. Neutralize. Again, Bill already talked about that a little bit. They'll talk about how we're, defending ourselves. Overseas contingency operation, power projection. Precision bombing strikes, precision guided missiles. Now, this is really important because this is really believed, Bill, that these things are precise, that we're only, that we can put this in some warrior's tent and just kill him and not his family even. That's not what we're doing. That's not possible. That does not happen. Even with drones, which you would think would be very precise, we're not talking preciseness here.
Yeah. Well, George, even when they are precise, they're only as precise as the intelligence that supports them.
Yeah.
So a lot of times, we're able to put the Hellfire missile, fairly close to where we're aiming at. And you see that in various videos online. But a lot of times we're like, oh yeah, that's a terrorist down there. And it turns out, no, it wasn't a terrorist. The intelligence was bad, or we were fed deliberately. We were fed lies by warlords in Afghanistan who said, yes, the terrorists are over there. And actually what we were doing is we were doing a particular warlord a favor by taking out one of his rivals. So, I mean, we may hit sometimes what we aim at, but we don't always know what we're aiming at.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah. It's all about, I don't know, what do you call it? Target selection it isn't, it's not a precise science here, folks. That's not what we're talking about. And then this last slide here has to do with, targeted killings and, as opposed to assassination or murder or whatever. And I would assume a good example of that would be that Soleimani deal over there, where we reached out and smote him. Okay, let me bring this up just to continue here with what Bill has to say. A war on terror is truly a war of terror because war itself is terrible. And this kind of gets into the oxymoron part of this. Friendly fire is being killed by one's own, often due to the chaos of war, the sheer waste of it all, exacerbated by incompetence. Fire is always unfriendly in war. Talk about friendly fire, Bill, because unless I'm mistaken, again, people have no idea of the magnitude, the amount of slaughter that occurs in war from quote unquote friendly fire.
Oh, absolutely. Probably the most famous case recently is Pat Tillman.
Yeah.
Pat Tillman, who the NFL player who left behind a lucrative NFL career, Arizona Cardinals, and enlisted. He was killed by friendly fire in Afghanistan. And you can tell it was very, very much unfriendly fire because, again, the military tried to cover it up. And it went all the way up to Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. Fire is never friendly. And it often happens in war, in the chaos of war, the confusion of war. You can't always identify who the enemy is. And sometimes troops panic and they start firing on each other.
Again, it's not precise. It's not pretty. It ain't Hollywood, folks. It's not what's been depicted in the movies and on television. Now, Suzanne asked this question. I've had this up on screen here for a minute or so. I don't know anything about this one. Maybe you've heard of it. Any comments on recent articles about how the U.S. has had a significant drop in availability of teaching the Chinese language domestically? This was touted as the most important language to learn 20 years ago, and it appears to be a pulling back so that we reduce our ability to understand the Chinese position ourselves, much like we see with Russia right now. I'd love to hear his thoughts. Well, my thoughts would be probably a lot of that has to do with politics. I told somebody on my show recently, I remember either in World War I or World War II, there were people in this country that slaughtered dachshunds because they were German in heritage or what, dogs, for God's sake. People do crazy things. And of course, a war with China is looming large under the Biden administration, as Joe Biden is as advertised. If you go to the horse races and you read the racing form, you'll know what I'm talking about. The criticism, the main reason that everybody with a brain didn't like Biden was because of his role promoting and supporting the Iraq war, and he's a warmonger. And they said, if you put this guy in, you're going to be at war, probably on several different fronts, which here today is exactly where we're at, Bill.
Yeah, the short answer to Suzanne's question is, I don't know. It very well could be that, let's say I decide to study Chinese, right? I could certainly see somebody like, well, why are you learning Chinese? Are you somehow pro-China? Why are you studying the language of a potential American enemy? I mean, there could be a little bit of truth to that. I don't know. I mean, Chinese is very difficult to learn for an American. When I was at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, we taught Chinese. We taught Chinese to service members. It's a Category 4 language, meaning it's one of the most difficult for Americans to learn because you have to learn the characters. You have to learn a tonal language that's difficult for us to master. It's very different from English. So it may be due to the difficulty of learning it, the shortage of instructors teaching it in the United States. I can say that probably that the Chinese are doing a much better job of learning English than we are as Americans learning Chinese.
Well, there's a challenge for you folks. You got some young people to get them to learn Chinese and get on the peace side, the diplomacy side, the resolution side of the situation that we've got with China, because we go to war with China. My understanding is particularly China and Russia together, we ain't winning that one, folks. That's not going to go well. We want to try to avoid that. And instead we're, rattling the sabers here. Okay. There he is. There's Captain Butt Crunch, as I call him. This is what I call the last bastion of yellow journalism. And the wording that we're talking about is all part of this propaganda, but also how we choose the images that are shown to us on our network, cable news in particular, and newspapers. You know how many pictures there are of Donald Trump You know how many, and they'll choose to show this. Why are they choosing to show this? Well, it makes him look old, makes him look lazy because he's on the golf course. A rich guy playing golf, people don't like. He's got his fist in the air. And for certain audiences, this is how they want to see this guy, because this is how and then you turn over on like a supporter network, you go over to Fox, there he is. Look at that guy. It's the same guy, folks. Why would you choose one of those photos over the other? I mean, you got to choose something. And then the last one is this one. And I think this is significant. People don't seem to pick up what I'm putting down, but I'm telling people, if your ass is on the line, if you're in courts all over America, if you're if they're wanting to try you on, insurrection charges and all that with January 6th, what kind of person would pose in a mugshot like this? What is he doing? Why does he look like that? That's not how he looks all the time, but that's how he chose to look for this photo. I look at that and kind of scares the bejabbers out of me. I look at this and think, he's coming. What is this? What's your take on it, Bill?
I guess for Trump, I read about that, and this was supposedly his defiant pose that he deliberately constructed, so to speak. And that's an interesting point about Trump, is that I have a smidgen of respect for him as a con man. He knows how to manipulate his own image. He is very good at it. We were talking in the pre-show. I remember those Andre Agassi commercials for Canon Camera, I think it was, where he said, "Image is everything." And of course, politicians know this. Celebrities know this. It's all about controlling your image and projecting strength, and of course, if you don't like Trump, as you said, you show the most unflattering images. If I don't like Joe Biden, for example, maybe I show him tripping. When he was at the Air Force Academy, he was leaving the stage and tripped over a sandbag, and so if I want to suggest that Biden's kind of lost his way, I'll show a photo of him tripping.
Yeah, we're about out of time here. I just looked at the clock. We got to move along here very quickly. I'm going to see if I can get some other comments up on screen here. Here's Suzanne back. She's just shouting out to somebody else that's watching here. With Trump here, I would liken him to one of the reasons he's been successful at this is because that quote from P.T. Barnum, supposedly, where nobody ever lost a dollar, underestimating the intelligence of the American consumer or whatever,
Yeah.
I'd look at Trump and say, my God, how dumb is he? Well, it works with a lot of people, and people like me would look back and say, my God, I would never do anything like that. Well, maybe that mug photo is something like that. Maybe that works for him. It's hard for me to believe, but the proof is in the pudding. The guy's been elected president of the United States. All right, before we lose Bill, I want to bring this up on screen because I want to get to this because it has to do with the words of war. And it has to do with this phrase, depleted uranium. Again, an oxymoron. This is a big story that a lot of people are not dialing into it. The United States they're going to send depleted uranium munitions to Ukraine. And I could get into this article, but Bill knows all about this stuff. Bill, tell us what that is and right. Tell us why this is an oxymoron.
Yeah. Well, depleted uranium is still uranium. It's still radioactive.
It doesn't deplete. That's the nature of it. That's what it is.
It's used especially in tank rounds. Very dense material used to penetrate the armor of tanks. But what I want to say is that, United States used this in the Iraq War. We used cluster munitions. We used depleted uranium shells. And basically, Democrats, liberals, what have you, they're all like, this is wrong. We should not be using cluster munitions. These are outlawed by over 100 countries. Depleted uranium shells. We should not be using these. It's radioactive. And yet now we're sending cluster munitions to Ukraine. We're sending depleted uranium shells, and no one or very few people are suggesting that this is wrong. So it goes to show you how, what we see as wrong or right is labile and malleable, with the government propaganda.
And Bill's a wordsmith. He's a great author. He's written these books, of course, and we're talking, about this horrible use of words. Go to his Substack and check out. We talked about gerontocracy on the last time that I had him on, the kleptocracy in America and how these people have enriched themselves, these politicians. And people just look over that. I mean, the Turtlehead McConnell, my God, look at the money that he's made. Nancy Pelosi, look at the money that, going clear back to, again, Vietnam and LBJ and all that. God, he went to Congress, couldn't even buy gas for his car, basically, and retired a multi-millionaire on a ranch in Texas. How do these people do that? But you'll have to go to Substack to check it out because we are out of time. Bill, you're great to come on the show, particularly on short notice. I want to give you a last word here. Wrap it up for us.
Yeah. Well, again, I'd like to just, tell everyone that please do go to wordsaboutwar.org. Check out the guide. I think it will encourage you to think, a little bit more critically about the words that you see so often, whether on cable news shows or in print. We really should. I go back to General Smedley Butler, who twice won the Medal of Honor. He put it very bluntly in the 1930s when he said, "War is a racket."
Yes.
And he said that he had become a gangster for capitalism. Now there's some blunt speak by a general who knew what he was talking about. So I encourage readers to check that out.
Yeah, you hear about Butler. He's one of the military leaders that had his head on straight and said some great things. So did Eisenhower. Thus, the Eisenhower Media Network. He warned us about all this stuff. And even Tulsi Gabbard used to. But I go, what in the hell are you doing, Tulsi? She goes around railing about these wars and the military and all that kind of stuff. And then she used to be in the medic part of it. And I used to give her a pass from that. Hell, she's she's part of the fabric. I don't know what to make of all that. I've tried to get her on my show. Like I said, Cornel West is scheduled to come on Monday, September 9/11.
That's awesome.
But yeah, if he comes on, but I've reached out to Tulsi Gabbard, but I can't get her to come on the show. But that's going to end it today.
I love Cornel West.
Yeah.
He's got a lot of great ideas and you can tell he's just a man of strong character and integrity.
Yeah, and the point that I'll make with him is he's beginning to move the needle. I'm telling people that picking people from within the status quo ain't getting it done. It's not changing anything. It's 1,000 paper cuts death from the Democratic side or a blunt instrument on the Republican side. It's all death. It's all destruction. People say, well, he can't get elected. Yeah, but we got to start somewhere. Let's start there. I mean, let's begin this process for God's sake, or we're all going to be dead in 20 minutes from a nuclear strike, accidentally probably, or 20 years from climate. Yeah.
As a former Democrat, I just want to say I'm just so disappointed in today's Democratic Party because it's become the pro-war party.
That's exactly right. And we'll check back with you again because that Substack is stellar. I mean, oh God, I got to get him on. So we'll get him back on again very shortly. Bill, thanks again for coming on the podcast by George LiveLine.
Thanks.
Yeah, folks, I hope you like seeing Bill Astore on Podcast by George and hearing us talk about things that you don't hear talked about very much. People aren't talking about the wordplay. They're not talking about this yellow journalism of photography and video selection that the media is using as an example. And this Chinese thing that we got into, I mean, that was news to me. So I hope you like all of this, and I appreciate all of the guest comments and people participating in the show. And folks, if you want to get more of podcastbygeorge.com, if you want to see the live streams live when they release, go to podcastbygeorge.com and sign up free. You can subscribe for Facebook and YouTube there by clicking their little badges and icons. And then if you just want to hear the replay in audio, you can do that on iTunes, Spotify, the iHeartRadio app, and all of those places. Again, those little icons are there. Click those. It'll take you right to those platforms, and you can easily subscribe. And again, it is all free. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.